Mystic Searches, Chapter 1. 1. You came for a small taste of the wonder to come, and I have charged myself with whetting your exotic curiosities. Perched in a commanding pose atop a repurposed overturned fruit cart, a young and rather attractive pyromancer exhorted a growing crowd of errant young people. There was a gold glowing corona around her unusually large pupils that dissolved unevenly into each crystal blue iris. Her mysterious eyes were accentuated by a dark painted line that split each cheekbone vertically, giving her a feral, almost inhuman look. For the cautious children in the audience, she was a worthy mascot of the wonders inherent in the Sage Lakes. Not far from these farms, a waning late summer sun cast a subtle orange hue over the makeshift market. Pop-up trading posts dotted the cobbled streets and dirt paths that spiderwebbed from the center. It was the penultimate day of preparation for the festival, and by now, the district around the Celestial Observatory had tripled in population. The hostels were already bursting, prompting wayfaring patrons to purchase tents and rent temporary plots in the farmers' fields. Playful music and the chattering merriment of relaxed laughter emanated from the taverns, displacing the steady hum of cicadas. The native scents of lilac, honeysuckle, and night-blooming rustler were bullied back by wafts of spit-roasted hode, smoky campfires, and the chemical perfumes worn by waves of passing aristocrats. And while the adults were occupied with the coming festival's frivolities, the foreign children mischievously searched the hidden pockets and stark shadows for something extraordinary. And in those shadows, away from the watchful eyes of the elder apprentices, the younger generation of Mystic Pain's fledgling Zani recruits occupied their leisure time by planting the seeds for elaborate, profitable schemes. Whispers had encouraged the children of the capital city's visiting elite to cut through the freshly harvested orchard, find the old stone well, reorient towards the setting sun, and then follow the manicured dirt path through the natural valley of younger Rookwoods. There, as the whispered promised, they would find some of the locals drinking cherry wine, dancing profanely to raucous music, and practicing their respective supernatural crafts for the Bija of Kantala. And for those who managed to sneak away and follow the instructions, the path led the children here, to her. Her pyromancy was accompanied by the droning ambient sounds of a young boy's lute, and the playful chatter of the rugged adolescents whose mere company their parents would deem toxic. Behold, the extorter continued, no incendiary device, no residue from any elixir, no flint, no steel, no powders, no potions, just an empty open palm, and yet drawn from the air itself through sheer will, spark and flame. On cue, fire sprang from her fingertips. It was a small blue flare that coalesced into a ball and began to dance around itself before collapsing into a puff of colored smoke. Even something this trivial compelled gasps from the youthful onlookers, who were hypnotized by this act of wonder, unaccustomed to seeing the supernatural with their own eyes. Can you make it bigger? The flame lit the eyes of a boy in the front row. He was 2 or 3 years beyond his pubescent voice change, but his curious awe threatened him with regression to a more innocent and impressionable age. Exorder grinned. After baiting every trace of attention with an uncomfortably long pause, she waved in a grand gesture, opening her opposite palm to the sky and thrusting upward. There was a tremendous heat from an orange flare that mushroomed upward and dissolved. The children recoiled from what came close to singeing off a few eyebrows, and then broke into a laughing, rolling applause. There was one dissenter, whose heckling slowly poked through their enthusiasm. He was older and not as easily enraptured by flashing light and color. When his words bullied through, they were formal in manner, and were laced with the condescension of aristocracy. I declare it a farce! I declare it a farce! It's a trick, an elaborate falsehood. Have none of you ever been to the Bija of Kantala before? Exorder shifted uncomfortably on her impromptu stage, which creaked under the redistribution of pressure. I assure you, no trick. By the power of Mystic Zmu manifesting as fire, this is exigence. But I do understand, you've grown up in IOI, you've been indoctrinated into comfortable agnosticism about these mystical affairs. Safe but sterile, without risk but without wonder. Her words took a sarcastic edge. What are you, a Junior politician? Maybe the son of a constable. You certainly have bureaucratic blood. Wait, I know. You're a very competent apprentice to an accomplished policy archivist. How fantastic for you. The dissenter's lip curled, but despite his pompous disdain for this gratuitous display of magic, he exercised a calculated demeanor. Her clever strategy had been to excite him with provocation, coax him into petulance, and reorient this crowd's perception of the heckling into the ravings of a disgruntled or even envious skeptic. The dissenter did not follow this lure. Instead, he stiffened. With a broad-shouldered confidence, he said, "You're callow enough to really believe your words would be an insult. Since some of you will undoubtedly be taken by her vulgar display, let me provide a taste of true enlightenment. Indulge me for a moment, and I'll explain the con from which I'm saving you." Exhorter's body slumped a degree as she lost the attention of some of her patrons. You are young. You have just arrived in the Sage Lakes for the first time. You find yourselves captivated by this young girl's flashing lights and inviting disposition. She's different. She's evocative. She is, perhaps, even a bit dangerous. In 3 minutes' time, she will swear to you that the ability to harness the supernatural is inside each and every one of you. Then she'll invite you to find her during the festival. Some of you will seek her out. You'll make it a matter of purpose. When you find her, she will stroke your confidence and assure you that she can sense your potential. And then she will predictably ask for a modest donation. You'll run to your wealthy parents to procure whatever arbitrary amount she ventures it will be possible to extort from you, and you won't much care because you don't yet have any real concept of the value of currency. Exhorter's eyes slowly narrowed into slits. She was quickly deflating. Now, upon accepting the offering, she'll show you just how easy it is to make this wonder happen. You'll struggle for a bit, for sure. She'll make you work for it enough so that it feels like a legitimate accomplishment. And eventually, you'll be convinced that it is you creating the wonder, that it is your hands capable of some supernatural pyromancy. She'll voice how amazed she is that you're such a quick study. She'll tell you to tell your friends to see for themselves if they too possess this ability. But there's one thing of which I can assure you. Beyond that meeting, your hands will be just as mundane as they ever were back in Iohai. It's a trick. It's an illusion. She doesn't peddle wonder, you see. She peddles fantasy. She doesn't sell you a skill. She preys on your naivete, your vanity, to sell you a false perception. Don't let her compel you with these cheap tricks. More importantly, don't give this girl or anyone like her a single bit of zen. The dissenter stared down the exhorter and punctuated the monologue with a weaponized, "And make sure to tell all your friends." In some ways, the dissenter had pulled off even more of a miracle than a spontaneous burst of mystical fire. Armed with nothing but oratory, he stole the wonder from a young girl who had the capacity to create flames with her bare hands. Just a few hurled words had cracked the veneer of his young charmer from the Sage Lakes. The tension of the moment stretched. The crowd fidgeted. Exhorter contemplated her counter and finally settled on, It sounds like you had quite a disenchanting experience here in the past. Is it possible you overestimated your own capacity for this sort of wonder? That is certainly one of the possible detriments of a life spent boxed by discipline and protocol. I assure you, the wonder of the mystics exists. Oh, there's no doubt that the wonder of the mystics exists, Dissenter nodded, his agreement a sharp barb. I believe that is beyond refute, but I'm equally certain that you don't possess it. The charge here isn't that there is no magic in this world. The charge here is that you are masquerading as a purveyor of the supernatural and posturing to profit from children who don't know any better. The charge here is my contempt for anyone who would prey on the wide-eyed innocence of youth, because that person lacks the integrity to attempt to earn an honest wage. Magic is real. My charge here is that you in the Sage Lakes, you who host the Bijou of Kintala, are all shameless frauds. You're as false as that abysmal aristocratic accent you've adopted for this nonsense. There was a moment of silence between these two imposing figures. It was marked by the reminder that a solitary lute droned on, giving this whole exchange a subconscious sense of production. Exhorter had been prepared for heckling and skepticism, but not for this sort of accusation. After a few seconds of deliberating behind murmurs of a disappointed audience, She jumped down from her pedestal and strode swiftly toward her adversary. On the way, she reached out and yanked a plank from a half-erected merchant stand. For a moment, the fire in her eyes suggested she'd stop the argument by driving the exposed nail through Dissenter's contrarian skull. People, including the potential target, put their hands up in defense, but Exhorter stopped short of swinging. And although it wasn't weaponized in the traditional sense of the word, the volatile threat did act as a clever weapon in this verbal argument by returning to her the full attention of this audience. Rather than face him, she turned her back on him. It was her turn in this trial to appeal to their curiosities and win back their favor. It is our new friend's opinion that all of this is fake, an illusion. It is my assertion that it is not. Fortunately, truth does not rely on opinions or assertions, not mine, not his. It relies on quantifiable fact. What value are hypotheticals when contrasted against personal sensory observation? With a quick gesture, the wooden plank became a flaming torch. You can take him at his word. You can take me at my word. But in either case, you won't really know. You'll only have our baseless perspective. Instead, use your own senses to understand the truths of the world. By your own analysis, determine, is this flame real, or is it some deception? Exhorter passed the plank to the crowd. Its edges were already charring, and its main body had begun to glow. The flame curiously left the convenient handle unaffected. The braver of the children took hold and inspected the thing, while others shied away. Some tested its authenticity by waving their hand through the dancing embers, immediately recoiling from the searing heat. When I speak of lack of integrity, this certainly makes a fine demonstration, encouraging children to literally put their hands in the fire. If the fire's not real, then why would there be any danger? Exhorter interrupted. If I lack integrity, then that would imply that you lack honesty, wouldn't it? Your sudden concern for these children's well-being exposes you. Where's that conviction regarding my fraud now, friend? Dissenter stepped forward and plucked the plank from one of the older children's deep contemplation. I never said the fire itself was fake. Obviously, this fire is bright. This fire is hot. This fire cooks the wood as one would expect fire to do. But there's nothing wondrous about that. That's the nature of fire. There is nothing extraordinary. And how then did the fire come to be? What natural force brought it to life? Dissenter dropped the plank to the ground and extinguished the flame under his feet. Now, that is an excellent question. Why don't you teach us how to manifest the flame? Teach us how to channel that supernatural power of Mystic's Mew, custodian of the magic of exigence. Exhorter suddenly caught on to the ingenious method of this trap as Dissenter sprung it with relish. Again, with a commanding sneer, he challenged, Teach it to us here. Now. All of us at once, while we're together to learn and to witness. Exhorter stewed for a moment before languidly offering, everyone's learning of the thing would require individual attention, and individual aptitudes vary. Oh, shame, Dissenter pounced. We could save all that time if we could learn in tandem. At least you passively acknowledge that you were shaping this in precisely the way I disclosed. At the end, I guess it would have been all about extorting profits, yeah? You want to show them wonder, but you want your commission? Fine. With one hand, he reached into a pouch strewn across his hip, and with the other, he began counting heads. 1, 2, 3, 10, 20, about 22 heads. Let's round it up to an even 30. If every single one of these 30 young persons would have sought you out, which they would not have, and you were to shamelessly con each of them in turn out of even, 100 zen, that's 3,000. He drew his hand from his pouch. Here's close to 5. Dissenter threw glimmering stones at Exhorter's feet. Closer examination of their purity and charge would determine if the Zen would appraise, but they did look to be authentic at quick glance. From his capital city attire and proper speaking cadence, there was no reason to believe otherwise. 5,000 Zen, on one simple condition. You demonstrate to us without haste, right here, right now, the secret to divining Mystic's Mew's fire of exigence. No other words, no arguments, no clever attempts to change the nature of this conversation. No tricks, no unnecessary banter, just the thing. And then all of it is yours. Skeptically, Exhorter examined the Zen. She wasn't sure exactly what to make of the offer. She won't, he told the children. She won't because she can't. I'll teach you, she offered. You personally, you exclusively. Here, in front of this audience. I will teach you and allow them to observe. Would that be sufficient? Dissenter considered it reluctantly, unconvinced it would be possible. I suppose if your process is clear enough. Oh, I can be clear on process, she waved. But I can't promise you possess the aptitude. Dissenter scoffed. Another convenient dodge. Fortunately for you, I am an excellent teacher. She opened her stance so that she was addressing both her new student to her right and her audience to her left. So we're agreed then? If only for the profane curiosity of the thing. The sound of the barefoot boy's lute lightened a bit as the young pyromancer announced with a cringe-worthy, condescending optimism, "Then let us begin talking about magic." 2. Dissenter's hand was outstretched, his fingers raised to the sky, twisting back and forth as if turning an invisible fixture. His face was slack with a pompous disinterest. "Here we are, then," said the aristocratic skeptic. "You see? Since I was never a planned part of this charade, there's no wonder to see. Since I was an unexpected variable in the complex deception, she had no contingency for my demand. Thus, no magic, no spark, no flame. If that's not evidence enough..." "Yours is a problem of will," Exhorter replied. "Your will is set to illustrating that this is fraudulent. And thus, even if you were able to tap the magic of Mystic's Mew, a magic that extends from will, your will manifested would only serve to avail that illustration." So, your assertion here is that because I do not want it badly enough, I'm incapable of producing your brand of magic? He dropped his hand with incredulity. That's quite an oversimplification, but right enough. "More convenient evasion," Dissenter bellowed to the small crowd with equal dramatic emphasis on each of the words. Remember this. If you find yourself captivated by what you see here in the Sage Lakes during this year's Bijav Kantala, and you're disenchanted by your inability to conjure it as readily as our hosts here, it's just simply a case of your apathy. You're at fault, of course. The Zani merely want it more than you do. And then to Exhorter, "Spare us." Dissenter made a move to recover the small fortune he'd thrown at the pyromancer's feet. "Your will may be weak, but I'm confident that theirs is not." Exhorter referenced the children in the crowd. "My young friends, disregard this man's doubt. Meet your aura, perhaps for the first time, and command to manifest the flame in our friend's cynical hand." "You've lost. These are children that you and your ilk will not be able to cheat, and they will tell their friends about this pathetic failure, and the whole generation will know in advance that the entire festival is a tragic sham." "See it in front of you, the flame in his hand," she continued to challenge. "Will it to exist. Abandon any notion that the flame is absent. The flame is there. It's already there. Know that it is there, and know that it is there because your will did put it there." Some of the children began to sharpen their stares or clench their fingers into fists. Their behaviors were quite random, but their intent obvious. "And furthermore," Dissenter pointed an accusatory finger, "I'd imagine there are criminal penalties for this sort of flagrant misrepresentation. Oh, I know you in the Sage Lakes have a much more relaxed system of justice, but I do sincerely wonder what a magistrate of the High Court in Iohai would make of this whole business." Reach beyond your senses and effect change with the knowledge that what you sense is wrong, that there is a flame, that your eyes have not yet shown you its light, your skin has not yet felt its warmth, but your senses are just catching up to what you know to be true. More children joined the erratic, senseless ritual. Some began chanting, some waving their hands, some wriggling their fingers in the air. There was no real identification with exactly what to do to conjure their will in a metaphysical sense, but their collective energy swelled into this beautiful optimism that maybe they could. People who use wonders of this world outside the attention of the mystics, who use them as a hustle for personal gain, deserve to be exiled. Dissenter threw his accusatory finger towards the southern skies. "A despicable swindler such as yourself deserves nothing short of a life of regret serving your pyromantic master Mystic's Mew in the fiery wastelands of Nark." To punctuate the final consonant's jolt, a red flame shot directly from Dissenter's pointed finger. The crowd shrieked. He withdrew the gesture, bewildered. The flame followed his recoil. In a panic, the confused skeptic flailed in an exasperated dance to shake off the flame, but the flame clung to him like a stubborn shadow. It grew with every desperate gesture. Before anyone could process this spectacular and sudden outcome, it had fully engulfed his hand. Exhorter's mouth fell open. Her words had the inflection of a long gasp. I don't know which, but one of you has a natural communion with exogens like nothing I've ever seen. Which of you feels it? The celebration shifted abruptly when the flame crept up Dissenter's arm and he began to scream. He fell to the ground and tried to smother it with the weight of his body, but that only seemed to anger it and began to spread to his clothing. The children cried out. No one knew exactly what to do. Dissenter did not quite get out the word before his voice cracked into pained squeals. The fire blossomed, beginning to char his fingertips. It crawled over his body with terrifying urgency. The children began to scatter. Tears sprang from their eyes. Exhorter stepped in to try and subdue the flames. First, she tried a bit of pyromancy, attempting to court it for a dance. This proved fruitless, so then she tried more mundane ways of smothering the flame, grabbing a tarp from the ground. The fire took on a sentient sort of directive, pushing back with physical intent and adopting the threatening pose of a ravenous animal. I'm sorry, it's too strong, it's beyond my control. Children of Ihoi, it's you, it's one of you. One of you has an unnatural level of raw power. Please don't go. Whoever it is must learn to control it. It's the only way to stop this. Come back. Dissenter's body was now burning so brightly that it was hard to determine his actual physical form. There was a sick sizzling and the growing smell of charred flesh that was uncomfortably similar to the spit-roasted hode being prepared at the local taverns. The curious children had almost completely dispersed, traumatized and horrified at what their dabbling in magic had wrought. The whole thing was accompanied by the unflinching drone of a lute. Don't go! Please, oh my, what a tragedy! You must all come and find me. You must learn to control this, lest it happen again. These were the last words that would ring in the heads of the fleeing children. These were the words that would stick with them. Please, come find me. You must learn to control it. She slunk down next to the body as the last of the hysterical crowd disappeared towards the orchard, back to their parents in the Sage Lakes Mercantile. Oh, forgive me. Poor deluded tourist, your intentions were good. Like rainwater into hungry desert sand, the flame drew back into the blackened pores of Dissenter's charred skin. I suppose Mystic Cyrene saw fit to seal your fate this way. Her voice adopted a tone of mockery, overemphasizing every nuance of aristocratic inflection. You poor, mundane fool. A powdery ash puffed from the lid as one white pearl of an eye flew open. Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Fate or force, causality or exigence, Mystic Cyrene, Mystic's Mew. An incarcerated hand reached up and wiped away the black bake from his face. The victim of the harrowing event pulled himself to a sitting position and chuckled. This was all a bit dark, even for you, said one of the locals. Maybe more observant children would have noticed that not one of them had made any motion of panic. The lute had never stopped playing. What's wrong with my accent, you bastard? Exhorter swore at the very much alive dissenter. I've been practicing it since spring. The dark, decorative lines, high on her cheekbones, spread vertically, revealing a second set of equally intense eyes. The wide pupils rolled more narrow as they adjusted from having been closed for an extended period of time. Oh, darling, it ain't your nature to blend. He pulled himself up, leaving a pile of black dust behind to reveal the ghoulish green, subtly scaled skin of his now naked body. To boast the point, his complexion lightened to take on a nearly human pigment, but this time he made no effort to hide the scales, which were mostly pronounced in a running pair up the back of his neck and on his arms just below the elbows. Whereas, to blend, that's kind of my natural state. Huh. I'm just surprised your forked tongue could get around that proper capital speak, she teased. He made a lurid gesture with said forked tongue, at which he responded by pushing him playfully back to the ash. The boy with the lute laughed. The small band of Sage Lake miscreants clapped with sardonic politeness. Most good, one asserted. Champion effort, another added. Cover that thing before you lure their mothers. Someone tossed him a tarp, which he snagged and wrapped around his waist as he stood. Yes. Thank you. It was a brilliant show, but hey, I can only take most of the credit. A few playful boos at his youthful arrogance. He gestured to the other players in the charade. Of course, the beautiful Physix Fascinex. He gestured to the faux pyromancer. Exhorter, the pyromancer, was actually Physix Fascinex, or Fezzi as she was best known in the Sage Lakes. She was a mutant child of the swamps of Swinhall and had been identified early as having special penchant for the force of decay. Out of this particular group of friends, she had been in the Sage Lakes the longest, and through the recursion of daily practice, had come to recognize the glory of her privileged appointment here was actually a cautious and unfortunate detention. She was no longer actively training to serve any mystic. Mystic Pan had long ago given up on shaping her stubborn conduct into a future acolyte. But now, her focused communion with her element made her too volatile to just throw back into the proverbial sea. So she was, in all practicality, imprisoned under the guise of cultivating her talents. In her captivity, she carved herself a comfortable misanthropic identity. With every breath, she practiced her rage against the perpetual existential boredom. And although her temperament was certainly classified as fiery, contrary to the dramatic production in which she'd just partaken, she had no special agency when it came to fire. The true master of the magic of exigence witnessed in that hidden cove behind the orchard well, as well as the true star of this well-rehearsed production, was the ironic dissenter whose real Myrindan moniker was Gloom. Gloom was an enigma. As one of the innumerable bastard sons of Zmu, the dragon in his lineage compelled his incessant ambition. He was the real pyromancer, and had been effortlessly choreographing the dancing flames in his partner's hands. And while his willful command of magic was strong, the confidence that drove his arrogant swagger came from his mother. Now, whether she had actually been Mystic Cyrene or just some Panatan witch who had great communion with the forces of divination, no one knew for sure. But in either case, Gloom prided himself on an unearthly foreknowledge of his great destiny. Being that exigence and predestination were astral antitheticals, one being the power of supreme agency and the other being a subservience to an illuminating fate, his aptitude in these opposing magics should have just nullified. Instead, he became a prize among Mystic Pan's young Zani recruits, having proven time and again that he possessed unparalleled aptitude along the entire magical spectrum. It all came to him so easily, making him the perfect prospective student. But the perfect student was also burdened with a wicked hubris, and a mind much less interested in the duties of a mystic. He was proportionally more interested in irreverence, such as tonight's vulgar con. And let's not forget our great conductor, the mastermind, the idea man. Change it up, he said. Expose them to the ordinary ruse, he said. Escalate it into something more unforgettable, he said. Literally burn the urgency into their brains. Oh, brilliant. Why did I not think of that? Give them some relish, quaint troubadour. Gloom gestured to Julian, black flakes still falling from his arm. Julian blasted out a few embellished strums of his lute. Julian was the only one of this group not born in the hidden continent of Myrinda. With every passing year, the memory of a more mundane world receded a bit, and the ubiquitous evidence of the extraordinary caused it all to lose a bit of luster. He had learned the unfortunate truth that when the wondrous becomes normalized, it becomes anything but. Mystic Pan had brought him into the fold after sensing something supernatural in his musical ability, but he'd struggled to find his place here. It was no mystery why he felt so comfortable in the company of delinquents like Gloom and Fezzi and the rest of this whimsical band of troublemakers. Oh, I don't know. I still don't get the purpose, said Oren, a curious farmhand of a fortune-teller. He'd been ambivalent about the extension of the ruse due to its added layer of complexity. It all seems so unnecessary. I mean, show the capital brats a little bit of magic, tease them a bit, that always suffices fine. Magic? Gloom recoiled, feigning offense. Magic? The tarp dropped, exposing him once again. Oh, put it away, you filthy dragon! One of the group bellowed from behind a stack of hay. Quadragon, only a fourth portion, but certainly responsible for my best features. Gloom thrusted his hips proudly, demonstrating that the reputation for his manhood was not an exaggeration. They all groaned. He continued, nude in the failing light. Now, Oren, magic? Do not blaspheme this with that detestable old euphemism. You had to get him started, didn't you? Fezzi chuckled, plopping down with her legs crossed like a toddler awaiting a story time. Oren took a swig from his cherry wine and a blood-red drop spilled down his chin. I regret it already. Magic is systems, it's spells, it's incantations and invocations, it's regimented and dogmatic, it's transactional and controlled, it's measurable, quantifiable, scientific and precise, it's contained in well-defined lines, rigid and practiced, it's the product of ritual and terminal of study, it follows and depends on rules. To call what we witnessed here tonight magic would be to trivialize its nature. Tonight, Fezzi? More rehearsed dialogue. Primal fabrication? Primal fabrication, Gloom echoed with bravado. He seemed to grow 3 feet as the sincere conviction in his monologue also satirized and mocked the self-importance of the mystics. The base ingredients of reality itself, manipulated by sheer will. No bounds, no limits. No silly ritual or incantation. Tonight, those children were not simply entertained by frivolous tricks. They witnessed an otherworldly control of the very makeup of everything. A control on par with absent ancient deities. Fezzi leaned to Julian. But honestly, Jules, was my accent really that bad? Gloom breathed fire into the sky, and the supernatural light suggested shadows of horns protruding from his forehead. The group was unimpressed. They'd seen it all before, too many times. Gloom laughed, covered up again, and took a seat between Fezzi and Julian. Remember, honestly, I was skeptical too at first. It seemed a bit too complex and unnecessary, but I gotta say, it was damn fun. And, honey, fire looked good in your hands. He both teased and flirted with their four-eyed friend. She just sneered. Yes, he continued, I think our little Jules earned in. I think that plan made some good marks for this year's festival. He clapped Julian firmly on the shoulder, and Julian didn't miss a note. The uninterrupted music of his lute was absorbed by the night. He took no offense to Gloom's condescension. It came packaged in a friendship with the narcissistic megalomaniac. Bijov Kantala, Festival of Balance, someone mocked. Bijov Kantala, Gloom barked. Festival of Profit. They all laughed. I wonder if we'll get another wave of kids tonight. Fezzi looked back towards the mercantile. Are you up for an encore performance? Oh, I think we can settle for the night, Gloom replied, laying provocatively next to her. I think it's past the brat's bedtime, but if it comes to it, I'm always ready. He had a way of framing any phrase about any single thing into inappropriate innuendo, and while his charm, rooted in that quarter-dragon lineage, was near irresistible for the mundane, Fezzi was quite immune. She cackled with a wave of her hand. The gesture produced boils on his tongue that swelled his mouth shut. Gloom gnashed and scraped his teeth against the mutation, then spit out the dead, unnatural flesh. Oh, that tastes terrible, he charged. To match your terrible taste in flirtation, she countered. It's not a thing that's going to happen. Not in this lifetime. I suppose you're safe for now. Darling, you're harmless. This volley was indicative of their entire relationship. Yeah, you're right, though. I don't feel done for the night, he grinned playfully. Fezzi blinked her four eyes independently, a gesture that was common for her when she wanted to remind those in her company that she was abnormal by nature. He was no longer flirting with her, at least not in a sexual manner. He simply wanted to cause more mischief. Her lips turned up. A story, then. She said it loud enough for those closest to hear. Maybe one from beyond the boundaries of Myrinda. It was a suggestion that came in the form of a question. Julian demurred bashfully, retreating into the droning tones that his fingers facilitated. But the promise of a tale from afar caught some attention among the playfully loafing young enchanters. There was a perverse irony in their occasional fascination with the unexceptionalness of a more mundane world. It often strode a razor wire balancing between condescending pity for his childhood spent trapped in the confines of the ordinary and fascination with the baffling unknowns of how a world without wonder could possibly work. At times, Julian felt ashamed to have been born unremarkable, always lagging behind his peers. But if in friendly enough company, the proper goading usually convinced him to satiate their curiosities. Oh, he has plenty, Gloom asserted, acting as agent. Of the sort that'll turn y'all into sniveling rats like that lot we just made scurry back to their mamas. Consider. That was all his design. How many of them do you think pissed themselves? That's what he can do, you know. It was an awkward compliment, and Julian's response was a complicated chemistry made of pride and disgust, accomplishment and a light dose of self-loathing. Rue shit, came the voice of Dondra, a young recruit who had spent the night drunkenly pawing at his even younger sweetheart. She had accepted the affection despite her polar sobriety, though, no, she looked a little bored. Tonight was good, stuttered Darasair. whose lineage to the tribes in the Maronan desert left her with hidden remnants of an insect mandible inside her jaw that sometimes impeded the clarity of her speech and made certain consonants click. But those kids, they're insulated. Wonder is scary. We've experienced. They have not. They're not. No offense, Julian, but I stopped being frightened by stories by the time I was capable of telling my own and grew to know what they were made from. Have you ever heard of the Wraiths of Verekai, Vezi proposed. Even knowing this was the turn the night would take, a tremor traveled Julian's arm to his fingers. The quiver sent out a vulnerable tremolo note that resonated in all of their minds. It was equal part intrigue and trepidation. The story of the Wraiths of Verekai was the exact sort of story for a night like this. No, I'm guessing you wouldn't have, she decided. You're all quite pedestrian to be aware of such things. Well, that rattled them. Challenged, they were all paying attention now. Julian mused, his eyes searching beyond the tree line. Well, it's not my story exactly, but one told to me by someone I met along the way. This story shared an intersection to the proverbial road that had led him from the mundane world to the mythical continent of Myrinda 2 years prior. To tell it properly, I'd have to invoke his words, his own voice, as if he were here telling it to you the way he once told it to me. His words implied that he was waiting on further invitation to begin his tale, but to the trained ear, the character, timbre, inflection, and accent in his voice had already taken on the properties of a gruff old-world soul. As his friends leaned to listen, Julian transformed into a tragic victim of good fortune, prepared to express the source of his runaway panophobia. The sound from the muted taps to his lute strings wound around their subconscious minds like webs from a famished spider. Perhaps less flashy than Gloom's pyromancy and less seductive than a salacious stare from Fezzi's 4 gorgeous eyes. If Julian had magic, this was it. They as a group never felt it happen, but they were no longer sitting comfortably on a grassy hillock behind the old well on the outskirts of the Sage Lakes Mercantile. Instead, their bones were stone cold in a damp, hidden, underground hovel due west of a mundane world port city, listening intently as a stocky Palisedo forest miner, whose hair had been scared white, recalled in first person the tale of his encounter with the Wraiths of Verekai. 3. I feel the need to share this with you to explain my total desertion from the company and my current isolation from the rest of the world. What I ask in trade for my candor here is that when my story is through, you forget my face and you forget whatever path led you to my door. Understand, I am not a superstitious individual. If I had a day's draw of ore for every night I was audience to some drunken miner rambling wide-eyed about the cursed mines of the Palisedo forest, I'd be retired in a golden tower above the cobbles of Varick Square. Those stories never moved me, not a step. In all honesty, I've always been convinced that those deep miners use stories of monsters and phantoms in an attempt to hide their cache of riches that they wanted to mine before the company got wise. That was a much more plausible explanation. Not that I'd ever descend into the mines past dusk, of course, but not out of fear of something supernatural. There are enough nocturnal dangers that lurk underground that one need not indulge weak-minded lunacy as an excuse to want to avoid them. Even the things that never see daylight share a rhythm with the moon and the tides. But to the point, I tell you all this because if I were to happen upon myself in a tavern and hear my own squalling, even having gone this firsthand, I would still disregard it. I was not, and still am not, a superstitious man. But the me who insists on his senses, if he is to be honest, must concede to tell of a thing that defies sense. It all began with a tragedy terrifying enough on its own. 3 of us were chasing a cascade of ore well beyond the last terminal of Bengalo's chamber. The last plinth was some bit in several narrow tunnels behind us, leaving our personal lanterns the only light to illuminate the shimmering promise of the waiting prize ahead. It wasn't so much greed for riches as it was satisfaction in the thrill of the find, I guess. Even still, it wasn't a yield we planned to register with the company, and as you might expect, we intentionally kept that deep excursion off record. It was an ill-conceived plan all the way around. There was Samer, Ornell, and me. Now, our impromptu partnership was quite strange. Neither of those muckrutters were friends, not of mine, not of each other's. Samer was a common gut grunt whose beast stew was too easily confused with his best coffee. Ornell was a fellow slackback, but rot lung from too many years spent breathing spores and dust and such forced him to stay shallow so that he was never a minute or two away from a surface breath, whereas I was still in my prime and could be found most days deep prospecting. Had our paths crossed? Sure. We all knew each other passingly. It was a tight enough company and a small enough campaign, but could I have picked either out of a crowd? Could I tell you their surnames? Could I offer a single detail about the life of either beyond our shared vocation? No, I could not. Our pact came not from any pre-existing relationship. It was all happenstance. On the same day, 3 totally unrelated incidents occurred. Samer had struck up a lunch conversation with some support architect who was cartographing the 6 arteries that began at Bengalo's chamber, and who had teased of the company's promising haul to come. "4th channel, you'll see," the cartographer had confided. "You'll know by the hum." Almost simultaneously, Ornell got in a pretty brutal skirmish with some scrappy young Polt who wanted to slight him for the handicaps that now ailed him so late in his career. While Samer was making a mental map based on the cartographer's generous and gratuitous disclosures, and while Ornell was finding that much of the physical fight left in the aged brawler had died long ago, I was summoned by the foreman and given an involuntary 3-day respite without compensation after my 3rd offense being caught hauling without a brace. And half between the midday and the sundown meals, peak time for the company to be fully engaged and the barracks to be the most quiet, we 3 found ourselves together. I was chewing on a quiet contempt for our company's leadership. Ornell had a bruised ego and was grappling with age-related inadequacies. And Samer had this unique, intriguing information with which he did not know what to do. You can reckon how pleasantries slowly evolved into whispered schemes. By dawn the next day, we were rappelling down the Hamashago well. By lunch, we 3 strangers had helped each other crawl through the twisted arteries beyond the final checkpoint of Bengalo's chamber to the unexplored caves beyond. As the architect promised, the 4th passage did hum if you strained hard enough. Or perhaps there was no hum at all, and it was more a product of our collective imagination. Not that there was much sense to any of this, but our order was also strange. Samer, with the least experience, led us. Maybe we found prudence in that he was the spindliest and therefore could contort into the tighter spaces to evaluate the likelihood of our safe passage. But as he was most a cook that spent very little time in the mines, I had to orient him quite often. Ornell went last, and although we'd never have said it out loud, all 3 of us knew that our pace was stunted every time the poor old man had to catch his breath. It wasn't just his age that had him cobbled, it was also the deflation in realizing that his usefulness was just about spent, a fact which he no doubt hoped to challenge with one last great haul. I kept between the 2, struggling to keep up with Samer's nervous enthusiasm while waiting impatiently for Ornell's lumbering frame to pull through the narrows. I remember in one moment marveling at the unnatural regularity of the pitted stalactites, so smooth and slick that they looked organic, and then in the next moment, I remember falling. Suddenly, there was no ground. Without a vent, our sure footing disappeared and the gravity swallowed us before we even heard the buckle of the rocks. The collision below, however, was cacophonous. It would have been impossible to separate the sounds of the large falling debris from the 3 bodies finding the bottom, especially in a moment of surprise panic. Breaking rocks and shattered bones are sonic twins. I was fortunate enough to land on what felt to be a softer bed of moss or fungus, but even still, my left hand exploded upon impact and the opposite knee popped out of joint. Reflexively, I arched into an inhuman shape and let out a beastly howl, but I choked on the settling dust and the falling pebbles that scratched down my open throat. My 2 companions, the spindly cook and the disgraced old man, made no sound at all. My guess was their landing had not been softened and their angle had not been as forgiving. This was every miner's dread circumstance. I was alone, with neither party nor public record of my exploration of this cave's vein. I was blind, far out of range of the nearest plinth without my own personal means of illumination, and I was more or less paralyzed at the bottom of a cavity of unknown depth without any realistic ability to climb out. My first instinct was surprisingly not panic. Instead, it was regret for a guarded life, I guess. I never married, nor even entertained interest in a romantic partner. I'd never fathered a child and only had fleeting relations with my own surviving family. I'd Never taken up a formal study or apprenticed for any specialized skill. I didn't have any close friends. I really had never made a notable mark on the world or anyone in it. In my horrified delirium, I thought about this for some time. You see, these are the things that are important when you realize that death is inevitable. I would blame my stoic contemplation on shock if the recollection wasn't so crystal clear to me now. Perhaps I remember thinking if I had forged meaningful relationships or commanded a presence among my peers, my absence would be noted and there might be at least some remote chance that someone would come looking for me. But lying there helpless and lame in that well of palpable black, I knew I had never been more than a strong back, and I would be missed no more than a dropped dining utensil in an aristocrat's kitchen. Oh, sure, don't get me wrong, I began hollering at some point. I swear I hollered at full volume until my vocal cords were calloused and bleeding, but honestly, I don't think it was motivated by self-preservation at that point. I think it was boredom, or maybe it was the onset of mania. Mania would go a long way to explain the direction of the experience. The first real anomaly was the elastic nature of my voice's echo. Initially, my cries reverberated as one would expect. While I hadn't my eyes to gauge, anyone who has spent quality time in caves or mines begins to develop a sense for space using sonic reflections. Whether or not I was able to process it through my conscious mind, I could at first venture a calculated guess as to the size and shape of the cavity that would likely become my tomb, but as the hours stretched, the reverb suggested that the dimensions of the cave were actively changing. The echoes would lengthen, making the space feel as if it had grown, then they would tighten, leaving the breath tight in my lungs. Before long, I was screaming just to hear the impossible phenomenon and trying to track any sort of pattern in the bizarre behavior of this cave. I would estimate I passed out 3, maybe 4 times, but it could have been significantly more. I cannot tell you how long I lay there. As a fever from my injuries took hold, my sense of time and, to my surprise, space fled as if it had no more use for my mangled form. It was upon waking from one of these blackouts that I became aware of sharing the space with something. It's not that I heard it, at least not yet, and obviously I couldn't see it, but I sensed it nonetheless. Perhaps it was a scent or a disturbance in the air, but I don't remember noting any of these things. It was just an awareness. It was the first time in my life I'd ever been literally petrified. I could not move. I could not speak. I could not breathe. I'm sure at that point I passed out again. Here, the fever began to stitch my dream state with my waking awareness. What were the stories of these mines after dark? What was the catalog of paranormal vagaries whispered about in taverns? Faces of lost miners catching in lamplight, the beckoning voices of departed loved ones. Well, fortunately for me, I had neither a lamplight with which to see nor any pronounced loved ones who might beckon. But I was haunted all the same. My estranged brother, who to my knowledge is still very much alive, stole into my mind at one point, and a mental picture painted by my bobbing consciousness reflected on the black cowl of coming to. So strange was it to register so vividly a sight in a dream, then see it visibly spill onto the canvas of that waking void. Only against a canvas of such black would such a thing be possible. The psychic charge from such abrasion between what I knew to be false and what I experienced doubtlessly only made the phantom more tangible. In the same manner that attempting to will yourself not to think a particular thought ensures that you're shackled to it, so was it with the specter of my alienated brother in that cave. I entertained the apparition with a pleasant conversation, not about our falling out nor about any family affairs, mostly about the conditions of the cave. The odd way in which it reverberated, the growing humidity that cradled me as I made peace with what was to come, the ghostly projection of my delirium proposed and repeated an ultimatum that only made sense when measured by the standards of dreams. In the typical condescending tone that had been so common of my older brother, he said that I could choose to succumb to the cave, or I could wake and share its wealth with the world. These weren't his words verbatim, mind you. I'm not even sure he was speaking. In fact, I'm sure he was not speaking because I know he wasn't real, but these were competing instincts that the apparition of my brother offered in that senseless metaphorical vernacular so common to the subconscious. The sudden awareness of an actual sound fully broke the spell. The introduction of a real external sense shattered the hallucination. It was subtle. It was the faintest drip. Not of something liquid, which would have made a very audible p upon striking the stone. No, this was a gloop, something gelatinous. It was a sick sort of sound, and it conjured images of drooling dogs or snail trails dripping from leaves or oozing honey. It's the sort of sound one would never hear if not for the almost complete sensory deprivation. I struggled to listen with an attempt to guess the size of the source, but with the room's dimensions continuing to fluctuate in the blind blackness, I couldn't even be certain I was hearing it at all. Then came the haunting whine. It was quiet. If you've ever been half asleep in bed and heard a morning mist change to the softest drizzle of rain, or if you've ever submitted to such quiet that you could hear the blood rushing through your ears, or if you've sat in a completely silent room until you heard that room's natural voice, then you understand what I mean by quiet. There was a sound that was present, but in a way that one cannot be entirely sure isn't imagined. The thing that made it most notable, though, was that it seemed to cannibalize all other sounds. It was perplexing, but I knew if I were to scream out again at that moment, this almost imperceptible hum would mask the scream into oblivion. And just when I had exerted every ounce of conscious focus I was capable of marshaling in order to define the sound, the thing in the dark made its presence known in the most undeniable way. The roar was triumphant and like nothing I'd ever heard. It was a short horn blast, followed by a series of clucking chortles that sounded disturbingly similar to human chuckling. Again, my breath seized as my muscles drew in unparalleled terror. The grand thing was just a few footfalls from my right hand. My only fortune here was that I was too frightened to make even the slightest of sounds, and the thing seemed unaware of me despite its proximity. There was an oral sensation that I could only appreciate by conjecturing through previous life experience, which conjured the perception of a fleshy body of massive proportion settling itself on the stone beside me. Once again, my brain balked at this because no creature I'd ever encountered or knew to exist was the proportion or makeup that was suggested by what my failing senses could interpret. Now, I've told you already I'm not a superstitious man, and I swear that it's true, but I'm not too proud to admit that in that moment I invoked the name of every mystic and every deity I can remember from childhood, on a long string of private prayers pleading with each entity that I succumb to my injuries before having to see the face or know the nature of the terrible thing sharing the cave. And look, you'll never hear an agnostic like me argue that a prayer or a promise to a god or a conjurer has the ability to spark some miraculous spiritual intervention. However, I believe that the effects on one's own psyche can be profound. It is, after all, how zealotry and fanaticism come to be, right? Not from authentic intervention from the divine, but by structured psychic mirages built of coincidence and pattern recognition. But to the zealot, the causality is real, and I, for the moment, was the zealot. One of those innumerable prayers bolstered me to will away some of my temporary paralysis. The throbbing dullness that I settled into turned into fiery agony. My left hand was little more than a hunk of misshapen clay. My right kneecap was backwards, but I wasn't dead. I let the reintroduction of agony be a crutch rather than an impedance. If I could continue to count the number of excruciating pain points from the top of my head to the tip of my smallest toe, it was a sign that I was still alive and that my body and brain were still communicating. Allowing myself to feel the pain was probably the best defense I had against the blooming madness. With great care, I slowly began to explore my surroundings with my right hand. I was able to confirm that my broken body was not sprawled upon rock. The ground was, as I had inferred, much softer. But it did not feel like fungus, nor moss, nor anything one might naturally find in the floor of a cave. I couldn't define it, but I was sure that it was too smooth to be either of those things. It was too pliable. A voice filled my head with my brother's condescension. Is the reason you fail to recognize this texture because it's so unnaturally cold? Yes. Yes, I decided that was exactly it. This familiar texture should have been warmer. Like a charging bull whose angry path was inescapable, the realization accelerated and finally struck me before I could dodge. My mouth puckered as all of my saliva receded and my heart all but gave out. Flesh. It was a thick blanket of human flesh that had prevented the painless charity of an instant death. Monster be damned. My voice took on the character of a banshee. The certainty that those screams would easily mark me and that I'd be devoured by my tomb's native inhabitant, that I'd be digested and shat out as a gross layer of organic mush could no longer counter the reflexive horror of it all. The raucous discord of my desperate cries masked any grotesque sound the thing might have made. But to my surprise, I was left unmolested. My screams settled into feverish chatters and I passed out again. The next phantom to straddle the divide between the objectively real and the dream manifestation was Vaccaro, the very first miner I knew to be lost in a collapse. We hadn't been friendly, I hadn't known him well, but from what I remember, Vaccaro was the spoiled kid of one of Verekai's elite, sentenced by his father to toil a while in the mines as punishment for some trivial transgression. The privileged manner of discipline which had mocked our station became capital punishment for the boy, who presumably perished in a cave-in. The straits in the city likely threw parades in his memory. He may have gotten a holiday for all I know, but not a tear was shed, nor a meal skipped, nor a pyre lit by any member of the company. The risk of such an end was a contract signed again and again with every step beyond the timber archways. No one entered who was not fully aware of the risk. The mines, while rich with ore, were also a boneyard. Or a skin heap, Vaccaro laughed. His manner was pleasant for a kid who died so unfairly. I tried explaining to him that he was dead. He was unimpressed with the revelation. His retort was, perhaps, but I'm here. Was the other thing true, though? Was he dead? Was he there? I was very far beyond the capacity to identify the fantastic. Where are you exactly? I asked him without consciously providing the impulse for the asking. He shrugged and gestured to the soft skin-like mass that cushioned my weight. And because I was now experiencing my tomb in that limbo state between sleep and wake, I could see it as clearly and as irrationally as I could see him. And I saw it all so clearly. My body lay broken on a blanket of liquefied flesh. Bones were dissolved, blood drained, skin was reconstituted into an ambiguous organic mound. This wasn't the end result of natural decay from those miners who had gotten lost and starved to death, who had fallen to their death in more dramatic rock slides, or were bludgeoned by falling boulders. This was all the excretion of some massive unknown creature. And as with the phantom who had worn the guise of my estranged brother, the ghost that had taken the shape of the unfortunate baby-faced Vaccaro posed an ultimatum. The lines of it were a bit cleaner coming from him, maybe because I was that much further along now. They were almost words, they were almost true external stimulus. He said in his way, stay and become the cave, or leave and spread its story. It was the second time these broad terms were expressed. I had no idea how I could select either option. At this point, all this was happening to me, not through any influence I was exerting on the situation. The visage of the boy was dragged back into its own black well. It was getting harder to tell, but that probably meant I was once again awake. As before, it was a real sensation, or what I thought to be a real sensation, that sifted the specter through the pores of logic and back into the recesses of my mind. The hum that had lured us to the mysterious fourth passage had grown. Even though it was still only a dull volume, it coated my ears, deflecting all other sounds, making me as deaf as I was blind. That's not exactly right, but it's the only way I can think to describe it. The thickness of the sound felt to be physically oozing into my ear canal, and its sticky coating was preventing any other vibration from getting to the drums. The only sound that got through the field of the hum was that goopy shifting of a behemoth body. I had the sense it was upon me now, all around me, above me, in some way I could not process even underneath me. I felt enveloped in a closing mouth, waiting for the sharp sting of long teeth. Not literally a sea, though the gradually increasing heat and humidity did also perhaps make it feel that way. I mean that on a psychic level, my entire being was caught in the maw. In a way, this thing was playfully gnawing on my five senses. And maybe the nectar of my aura was what sustained the thing, or at least was a pleasant confection, and it was spilling off of me as the thing took its first nibbles, dribbling down its proverbial chin. Those wasted psychic juices were manifesting in the cave as faces familiar to me. There it was. From the incoherent tumble of dying thoughts were the wraiths of Verekai hypothetically explained. Perhaps there was a real creature, or species of real creatures, that existed in that void. These creatures subsisted physically on whatever unfortunate organisms fell into the blackness, but as creatures starved for sensory experience because of that blackness, also relished the flavor of a man's consciousness and record of sensory experience. The floors and the walls of this creature's domain were coated with an organic waste byproduct, recognizable in disturbing familiarity as human skin, while the psychic crumbs of aura and memory were littered about from the thing's desperate, sloppy, ravenous devouring. It was either that insane explanation, or the explanation is that I'd gone insane. The thing that troubled me about this realization was that if it had any merit, It meant that the crumbs of my consciousness I'd seen, those phantoms I'd recognized, were evidence my aura was already in the process of being chewed. I began to laugh, as I can imagine anyone would. There was no sound to it, you see, thanks to the thing that was sucking all the sense out, but I was still able to feel the heaves of my chest. I laughed harder because, honestly, what else is there to do upon accepting the end of a dull, recluse life but to laugh with hopeless resignation? That is why I surprised myself so when, as if controlled by external forces, I hurled my body through the dark and lunged with my good hand. It was a desperate mechanical gesture, and the single thrust was a valiant act of the will over the physical. With my body in its shape, there was no hope for a second action, but that futile lunge was not fruitless. In that pitch black, my hand connected with some alien substance. It was viscous, and it caved a bit to the force of my open palm, as if I'd taken a swing at a taut tarp hanging on a line. More accurately, it was the loose membrane of a low and powerful drum. And as it would with the membrane of a drum, the contact made a percussive roar. My hand, now wet with a sticky gel, ricocheted with a satisfying bounce, and the force turned me away so that my back was to the thing. And as if I'd struck the jaw of a man in mid-bite, the creature spat out the contents of his meal. The cave, all at once, in ways that words cannot adequately explain, took the shape of my childhood home, my junior school, the interior of a tent, by a lake at the mouth of the Palisedo Forest, of the mine barracks, of the sharp descent into the Hamashago Well. Every familiar place distorted and interwoven in senseless, dimensionless impressionism. Familiar phantoms scattered into the abstract seams of the psychic projections like somnoworms at the sudden spark of a bright light. My brother, Vaccaro, so many others whose identities seemed to be less precise, or perhaps the memory of whom were more thoroughly chewed, fled from the boom of the drum, which I realized unsurprisingly contained the undertone of the cave's natural hum. With the swell of the drum sound, the heat blossomed against my back and shoulders like a harsh sun on a summer noon. In the chaotic frenzy of hallucinations and the distortions of sights and sounds, the heat was the one tether that asserted itself as evidence that some part of this was real and not all just a consequence of a fractured mind. Unlike a drum, the sound did not subside after the initial strike. It picked up new frequencies as if the cave itself was adding sympathetic vibrations. The colors of the haunted vision swirled and bled together and took on new beautiful shades that were not perceptible to the human eye, but that I could see in vivid reverence. The shapes and structures broke down into simpler geometry which folded and bent in impossible angles. This all accelerated with the growing hum, now molded into solid fingers that violently pushed into my ears. It took all of my nerve and all of my will, but I was able to slowly ratchet my head until my eyes could look to the ceiling. In my direct vision, there was nothing to see. I was still oppressed by a black blanket. In my mind's eye, that maddening flurry of sensory stimulation continued in its illogic. The disparity between the two turned my stomach and made me feel as if I was perpetually falling, but I persisted and my persistence paid. I managed to see it in my peripheral. In that fringe place that straddles the boundary between true perception and unconscious interpretation, the thing, the monster, the beast that fed on the mind as well as the body, I saw it. Or rather, I experienced the true form of it in a way that can most accurately, if a bit imprecise, be described as having seen it. Scale and exact shape were impossible to determine, you see, because the blackness of the space wasn't allowing me to truly see anything. Vague, I know, but I was able to perceive a sight of it as much from the way the sound moved around it as I was from the improbable semi-conscious visual in my periphery. I know none of this makes any sense. It doesn't now and it didn't then. I can only retell it as I experienced it, and this is how it went. As well as I can describe, a giant eye levitated in the space. It was situated in a somewhat spherical frame, but one that bubbled and gyrated and stretched out of focused form. A thick layer of translucent mucus or goo slopped out of irregular pores. Its pupil was wide and reflective, and did not reflect the black of the room, but instead the false light from all the abstract visions that fought for credence in my failing brain. My awareness stunned it. Now, in retrospect, that makes a certain amount of sense. If this thing did subsist on our perceptions and suddenly found that it was consuming a rare perception of itself, would the autosarcophagy be cause for pause and evaluation? Would the self-cannibalization be the equivalent to the pain of harshly biting one's tongue? Which had disturbed the thing more, my open-handed physical slap or forcing it to taste its own metaphysical blood? I had managed to affect it on both levels, in both of its realms of being. Its temper, though, literally flared upon recovering from the stunned state. The heat in the room became unbearable, and my own eyes began to burn. Closing them did not help whatsoever. A curious phantom of Samer poked his head from the abstractions that continued to jumble behind my closed eyes. "It's a matter of proper preparation, you see," he said with astonishing clarity. "You're quite lean. That is to say, the meat on you is a bit stingy and stretched thin. You gotta bring out the flavor." It had all the science of nightmare. Was the ghost of the mining company's incompetent cook suggesting that the beast was roasting my psyche? Were my perceptions more delectable when brought to the right temperature? And maybe most pressing of all questions, why was this realization, which felt oddly implicit, the least surprising, least disturbing part of the whole ordeal? Because this point finally marked my full psychological collapse. Then abruptly, amidst all of that, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. The next sensation I became aware of was being lifted. This may have come after hours, or it may have been in the next moment. Eyes still closed, I tried to thrash against whatever malevolent thing was taking my body, but my injuries prevented much protest. "I gotcha," said a voice. "I gotcha, kid." I opened my eyes. There was a trace of light in the room now, about as strong as what a lone personal lantern could produce. My right arm, the good arm, was thrown over a pair of broad, strong shoulders. It was Ornell. My first instinct was still panic, but all 5 senses had returned, and I could smell this old man's sweat and the pungency of his aged leather gear. This wasn't another specter. This was material. My eyes darted around the room. The light was too faint to see much, but from my vantage, propped up by this senior miner, I found no direct evidence of a giant eye or mounds of skin. The evidence of my experience may have still been there, lurking just inside the mouths of the many black shadows, but there was nothing quite as sobering as the abrupt return to sanity. Before my mind restarted the mechanisms that would have had the capacity to construct proper questions, Ornell filled in a few holes of the narrative. "You and Samer went down. I ain't found him yet, but I expect from the look of you that twig is probably splintered good, maybe cracked in half. Have you heard him? A cry? A breath?" To which my mind responded, "A recipe for deep-fried psyche?" Of course I didn't say that. I just shook my head and winced when my neck audibly cracked at the gesture. The fall hadn't taken the 3 of us. That's what Ornell was saying, just Samer and I. He, who had struggled to keep up with us, was spared the fall and had found a way down to mount a rescue. "I'll have to come back. More hands, more lights. It's unnaturally dark down there." Yes, he was right about that. Now, hypnotizes you, don't it? I was saved. All that I heard in each of his syllables was that I was saved. I then questioned the entire experience. Had any of it been real? Any of it at all? Of course not. That's the obvious answer, right? It had been a fever dream brought on by increasing delirium, dehydration, the injuries, the concussion, complete sensory deprivation, the psychological turmoil of impending death. Of course, none of that obscene flight of reason had been true. I'd fallen into a deep dark hole. I'd teetered on the knife's edge. That very natural thing had been the impetus for the short acquaintance with the Wraiths of Verekai. "Kid, can you hobble? There's a tunnel up yon where the slope is a little bit less intimidating. I fetch we can get you up through. Crawling back through the narrows will be something ugly, but I feel I can get you back to the barracks with at least a thread or two of life still attached." Ornell was the hero, you see. That's what I was thinking in that moment. He had began the day as a defeated expendable, long beyond proper retirement. He was ending the day saving my life. He found his purpose on this excursion. This could be a high note on which he could go out, an achievement to be celebrated. Now, maybe those same ignorant young polts that would have scoffed at his geriatric ineptitudes would sing songs and tell stories about his inspiring last valiant act in the mines west of Verekai. Maybe it was the overwhelmingness of relief in me, but the smile that drove back the pain in my back and hand and leg and head came with some personal promise to myself, regardless of my own handicaps from that moment forward. Maybe I needed to also do things worthy of songs sung and stories told. Maybe I needed to right the regrets that had occupied my mind when death had seemed certain. Maybe that was the lesson I could take with me from the Wraiths. As I craned to take one last glance back to the black of my tomb, I sent a dart of mental intent at the root of my psychosis. One more jab at the fantastic beast of my unconsciousness. I beat you, I thought. I escaped you. So then, you may ask, why am I hiding in this unmarked hovel? What offset my newfound purpose? It was the gravity of the next words of my savior, Ornell. These words have haunted me every second of every hour of every day since, and I'm sure they'll continue to haunt me until my death. "Come on now, kid," he tugged me forward. His jovial inflection was innocent enough. "You can either stay here a permanent fixture in this cave. Let me help you get out of here so you can tell your harrowing tale." My mind heard not the words, but punctuation. I realized it wasn't an ultimatum at all. It never had been. Ornell, if it was in fact Ornell, was unwittingly repeating the themes of the cave's phantoms. When we did return to the barracks, I never spoke a single word of what I experienced in the cave. I never warned a single person. In fact, I lay in the infirmary in a catatonic silence until I was well enough to walk, and then I walked away into the woods. Ornell, though, had taken a search party of very experienced and capable miners, some of the same that had formerly ridiculed him for his age, back to the fourth tunnel beyond the Bengalo's chamber, to the tunnel with the almost but not quite imperceptible hum. As of my departure some days later, that search party had not yet returned. Julian let the implications of the tale fester in the minds of his listeners. Compared to the story they thought that they'd heard, he hadn't verbally articulated more than a small fraction. What he'd done instead was use his lute to charm them. Yes, he'd nudged their impression a bit and set the groundwork with some choice verbiage, and then he'd simply tapped into the musical motifs that were once present when he had actually sat with a terrified former miner in a hidden hovel west of the mundane port city of Verekai. At the nature of his playing, the details of the story had filled themselves in. Through this process, his Sage Lake friends not only heard his tale of horror, but empathetically experienced it. Now he eased up on the enchantment to force them to individually process the experience through which he had led them. He held a single note on his lute and thumbed it lightly to let it drone, mirroring the terrible hum of the caves from his story, and he bookended the experience in third person with his own voice. The miner expressed to me once again that he was not a superstitious person, but that examining the logic only allowed for 4 possibilities. He saw the light come back into some of their eyes as they broke from the hypnotic hex and settled their attention on him fully. The first potential truth was the one most comforting. It was simply that the miner had gone insane, that none of this experience actually ever happened, that Ornell and the search party were lost to the unexplored mines like so many miners before them. That truth was tidy and practical. The pragmatist in him loved that explanation. The second potential truth was more troubling by far. The second scenario is that the exorcisms at that place had not been Samer's first, that Samer the cook had gone prior, alone or as part of a previously lost party, and after the unreal experience with what existed there, had been offered the same ultimatum to stay and be devoured by the monster or return to tell the story, that is to say, to find a way to lure more into the hungry mouth of the psychic beast. In that scenario, he had chosen the latter, and the miner and Ornell had been the next intended catch. Julian and friends were all pitched forward, their mouths open and their eyes glazed. Horror and wonder were plastered on each's face. He couldn't help but enjoy the power of it. For someone often ostracized for having so little aptitude with the toys of the deities there in Myrinda, he sure could cast a certain kind of spell. And the third potential truth, the third potential truth that he acknowledged as possible was that he was not there with me at all to tell the story, that he was still in the tomb, unwittingly imagining all of this realistic fantasy into being, creating me, you, this place, everything we know to exist, all a manifestation of the perpetual wrestling that pitted his conscious mind against the vivid dream state, harvested by and then slowly digested in the belly of the horrible monster. There were a few uncomfortable sighs, a strained chuckle. And the fourth, an awestruck Dara Ser clicked. Julian dropped his fingers from the lute and met her eyes, twisting his head unnaturally and tilting his brows into a menacing V. The fourth truth? The fourth truth is that you are trapped inside the beast. You are concocting all of this fantasy, and that this story being told by this manifestation of me is your mind desperately trying to show you this terrible truth. He paused as the last of the sound of the lute evaporated into the evening. He let the silent tension exasperate each and every one of them, and then said in his most morbid tone, "Insane as that sounds, you'll know it's true when you feel your thoughts warming, when you feel that every sensation is being roasted on a fiery spit. A sudden flame sparked around each of their heads, and every single person listening, except for Gloom, screamed like a child. Gloom, on the other hand, fell to the ground cackling. Even Fezzi, who knew the story and the joke that was coming at the climax, had to shake off the effectiveness of Julian's telling. I'm sorry, they made me do it, Julian laughed, pointing to his closest friends. There was a mixture of laughter and cries. Someone threw a small stein at him, narrowly missing his head. See, Gloom laughed in the commotion. You're all still a bunch of spoiled children, no different from the kids from Io High. Fezzi leaned to Julian. I love that story, and that was an exceptional telling of it. She kissed him quickly on the side of his mouth. It wasn't a romantic gesture. Fezzi was just an affectionate type, and she was quick to show appreciation for anyone who found a way to affect her. It's a true story, Julian appealed to the disgruntled yet fully entertained larger group. I mean, it's mostly true for my part of it. The group groaned in response, all shaking off Julian's hypnosis. This was all a common enough night of innocent mischief in a long string of nights of innocent mischief. The questionable ethics on display of tapping the world's magic for this sort of gratuitous use were the type that the elder generation would scoff at and condemn, despite similar antics peppering their own youth. As a crescent moon rose between the shadowy peaks of Mount Potan in the north, the cherry wine flowed, the scrappy adolescents from the sage lakes danced, various types of magic were invoked with reckless abandon, and there was not a care to be had. It was an evening to revel in the privilege of their generation. Their boredom and transgressions were an outgrowth of ecstatic security. Their needs were met, their stomachs were full, their lives were stable. They had no great cause or war over which to worry. The grooves of complacency had been carved into canyons. And yet, a mere mile away, Mystic Pan was locked in an irksome trance, vexed over a simple misalignment of a lonely dim star. While his recruits were busy at the reckless pursuits of ignorant youth, while Gloom was scaring children and Julian was telling ghost stories, he stared up at the peaking night through the dome of the observatory, transfixed by a pinhead blemish amidst the galactic tapestry of millions of points of light. Autonomically, he whispered a sentence that would be quite innocuous coming from any other mouth. But in the deep growl of Mystic Pan, custodian of order, a man who carried the immense burden of balancing the powers of divine wonder for the entire world, the words became a frightening harbinger of the cascade of catastrophes to come, exponentially more frightening than Julian's embellishments about a psychic cave monster. Recognizing, then articulating, as if with the futile hope that his eyes would present some antithetical evidence, he whispered to no one in particular these 4 terrible words. These stars are wrong.